On the morning of February 14th, 1943, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh climbed into the cockpit of a Vought F4U Corsair for the first time at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California. Walsh was 26 years old, had been flying Wildcats since Pearl Harbor, and carried the combat experience of 17 months in the South Pacific. He'd survived 32 missions, watched friends die in aircraft that couldn't match Japanese Zeros, and learned to fight defensively because American fighters couldn't dominate offensively. But this aircraft was different. Walsh had heard rumors about the Corsair. Pilots called it the bent-wing bird because of its inverted gull-wing design. Some called it the ensign eliminator because it was supposedly too difficult for inexperienced pilots to handle. The Navy had rejected it for carrier operations. Too dangerous. The landing approach was too fast. The nose was too long. Visibility during final approach was terrible. Pilots couldn't see the deck. They were landing blind. So the Navy gave the Corsair to the Marines, who operated from land bases where visibility wasn't as critical and runway length wasn't a problem. Walsh didn't care about the Navy's opinion. He cared about one thing. Could this aircraft kill Zeros? He'd find out soon enough. Walsh started the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. The sound was different from the Wildcat, deeper, more powerful. The entire airframe vibrated with restrained energy. 2,000 horsepower, more than any fighter Walsh had ever flown. He advanced the throttle and taxied toward the runway. The Corsair's nose rose steeply in front of him. He couldn't see forward at all during taxi. He had to S-turn back and forth just to see where he was going. Naval aviators had complained about this exact problem, but Walsh lined up on the runway, straightened the aircraft, and pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair accelerated violently. Walsh felt himself pressed back into the seat. The aircraft wanted to fly. At 60 knots, Walsh pulled back gently on the stick. The Corsair leaped into the air. The climb rate was extraordinary. Walsh retracted the landing gear. The gear folded upward into the wing, disappearing smoothly. He raised the flaps. The Corsair climbed at 4,000 feet per minute, maybe more. Walsh leveled off at 10,000 feet and began testing basic handling. The controls felt different from the Wildcat. Heavier, more responsive at high speed. The Corsair tracked beautifully, stable, solid. He tried a gentle turn. The aircraft banked smoothly. He reversed direction. The roll rate was good, not as quick as a Zero at low speeds, but better than a Wildcat. Walsh pushed the airspeed up. At 200 knots, the controls remained responsive. At 250 knots, the Corsair felt even better. Crisp, precise. The ailerons didn't freeze like a Zero's fabric-covered surfaces. The Corsair could roll at any speed. Walsh tried a high-speed dive. He pushed the nose down and watched the airspeed indicator climb. 260 knots, 280, 300. The Corsair was still accelerating. The controls remained solid. No flutter, no vibration. Just smooth, controlled flight at speeds that would have torn a Zero apart. Walsh pulled out of the dive easily. The Corsair handled the G-forces without complaint. He zoomed back to altitude using the momentum from the dive. The climb rate was still impressive, even after the high-speed run. Walsh flew for 70 minutes on that first flight. When he landed, he knew the war had changed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Corsair wasn't just better than the Wildcat. It was better than anything the Japanese had flying. More importantly, it was designed to exploit every weakness American pilots had learned, from fighting Zeros. The high-speed performance, the powerful engine, the heavy armament, the rugged construction. Everything about the Corsair was built to win the kind of fight American pilots wanted. Fast, aggressive, deadly. No more running from Zeros, no more defensive flying. The Corsair could hunt. What Walsh didn't know was that within 6 months, Japanese pilots would fear the Corsair more than any other American aircraft. They would call it the whistling death because of the sound its air intakes made during high-speed dives. they would develop specific tactics to avoid engaging Corsairs. And they would die in staggering numbers when those tactics failed. The story of how the Corsair became the most feared American fighter in the Pacific began not in combat, but in a design office in Stratford, Connecticut, in 1938. Rex Beisel was chief engineer at Vought Aircraft. He was 43 years old, a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and one of the most respected aircraft designers in America. He'd been designing naval aircraft since 1923. He understood the compromises required for carrier operations: short takeoff distance, strong landing gear, folding wings, a resting hook. But in 1938, the Navy gave Beisel a different assignment: design the most powerful, fastest fighter possible. Carrier compatibility was secondary. Performance was everything. The Navy wanted a fighter that could match or exceed anything the European powers were developing. War was coming. Everyone knew it. The Navy needed aircraft that could dominate future combat. Beisel's team started with the engine. The most powerful engine available was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It was massive, heavier than any engine previously used in a single-engine fighter, but it provided the power needed for exceptional performance. The problem was the propeller. 2,000 horsepower required a large diameter propeller to convert that power into thrust efficiently. A larger propeller meant longer landing gear to provide ground clearance. Longer landing gear meant more weight. More weight meant reduced performance. It was a classic engineering problem. Beisel needed ground clearance without the weight penalty of long landing gear. His solution was revolutionary. Instead of mounting the wing straight across the fuselage, Beisel designed an inverted gull-wing. The wing angled downward from the fuselage for about 6 feet, then leveled out horizontally for the remaining span. This design allowed the main landing gear to be mounted at the lowest point of the wing, where it was shortest and lightest, while still providing adequate propeller clearance. The inverted gull-wing had another advantage. It created a nearly perpendicular junction between the wing and fuselage, which reduced drag. Less drag meant higher speed. The design was elegant. Unconventional, but elegant. Beisel's team built the first prototype, designated XF4U-1, in 1940. The aircraft made its first flight on May 29, 1940, with test pilot Lyman Bullard at the controls. The performance was stunning. On October 1, 1940, Bullard flew the prototype to 405 miles per hour in level flight. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. The first fighter in the world to exceed 400 miles per hour while carrying a military load. The Navy was impressed. They ordered the aircraft into production immediately. But there were problems. Serious problems. The Corsair was difficult to fly. The long nose blocked forward visibility during landing. Pilots couldn't see the carrier deck until the last few seconds of approach. The stall characteristics were dangerous. The left wing would drop suddenly and without warning. If this happened close to the ground during landing, the pilot had no time to recover. The aircraft would roll inverted and crash. The bounce characteristics on landing were severe. If the main gear touched down first, the aircraft would bounce back into the air. If the pilot tried to force it down, the aircraft would bounce again, harder. Multiple bounces could damage the landing gear or cause the pilot to lose control. The Navy conducted carrier qualification trials in September 1942 aboard the USS Sangamon. The trials were a disaster. Pilots described the landing approach as terrifying. They couldn't see the landing signal officer. They couldn't see the deck. They were landing by feel and hope. Several aircraft bounced so violently they damaged their landing gear. One aircraft ground-looped and nearly went over the side. The Navy concluded the Corsair was unsuitable for carrier operations. Too dangerous. Too many ways for inexperienced pilots to get killed. The decision was devastating for Vought. They'd built the world's fastest fighter, and the Navy didn't want it on carriers. But the Marine Corps wanted it. The Marines operated from land bases. Visibility during landing was less critical. Runway length was adequate. The bounce problem could be managed on a long runway, and the Marines needed every advantage they could get. Marine fighter squadrons had been flying Wildcats since Guadalcanal. The Wildcat was tough, but outperformed by the Zero in almost every category. Marine pilots were dying because their aircraft couldn't match the enemy. If the Corsair was faster, more powerful, and better armed than the Zero, the Marines would learn to fly it. They'd accept the landing characteristics. They'd train harder. They'd adapt. Because the alternative was continuing to fight in aircraft that couldn't win. The first Marine squadron to receive Corsairs was VMF 124, commanded by Major William Giese. The squadron received their first F4U ones in September 1942. Giese was 30 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, and an experienced fighter pilot. He'd flown Wildcats at Midway. He knew exactly how outmatched American fighters were against Zeros. When Giese first saw the Corsair, he understood immediately why the Navy had rejected it. The visibility was terrible. The nose was enormous. During taxi, pilots couldn't see anything in front of them. During landing, the deck disappeared beneath the nose until the aircraft was almost on the ground. But Giese also understood the Corsair's potential. It was faster than any Japanese fighter. It could climb with a Zero. It had 650 caliber machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition. 400 rounds per gun. That was firepower the Wildcat couldn't match. And the Corsair was tough. Armor plate protected the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks protected against fire. The aircraft could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. Giese told his pilots they would master this aircraft. No excuses, no complaints. Lives depended on learning to fly the Corsair well enough to exploit its advantages in combat. VMF 124 trained intensively for 4 months. They practiced carrier-style landing approaches on runways. They learned to S-turn during taxi to maintain forward visibility. They practiced the landing approach repeatedly until every pilot could handle the poor visibility and tricky bounce characteristics. They practiced gunnery until they could hit targets consistently. They practiced formation flying. They practiced high-speed intercepts. By January 1943, VMF 124 was combat-ready. They deployed to Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. Guadalcanal was still an active combat zone. Japanese bombers raided the airfield regularly. Zero fighters swept over the island looking for targets. Marine pilots flew multiple missions daily. Combat was constant, brutal, unforgiving. Kenneth Walsh arrived at Guadalcanal with VMF 124. He'd completed his transition training on the Corsair and was ready for combat. His first mission in a Corsair came on February 14, 1943, Valentine's Day. A combat air patrol over the island. Walsh and 3 other Corsairs were orbiting at 15,000 feet when the call came. Enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest. Altitude unknown. Walsh's division leader turned toward the threat. They climbed to 20,000 feet, positioning themselves above the expected contact point. At 22,000 feet, Walsh spotted them. 9 Japanese bombers in tight formation, escorted by at least 15 Zeros. The Zeros were above the bombers, protecting them from exactly the kind of attack Walsh was about to make. Walsh's division leader called the attack. They would dive on the bombers, make one firing pass, then extend away using speed. No turning fights with the Zeros. No slow-speed engagements. This was a hit-and-run attack. Exploit the Corsair's speed, advantage, and get out. Walsh rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a steep dive. The Corsair accelerated quickly. 200 knots, 250, 300. The engine sang at high power. The airframe was rock solid. Walsh picked a bomber on the right side of the formation. He adjusted his dive angle slightly, lining up the deflection. At 1,000 feet range, Walsh squeezed the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns roared to life. Tracers streamed toward the bomber. Walsh walked his fire into the target. Rounds hammered the bomber's fuselage and right wing. Pieces flew off. Smoke erupted from the engine. Walsh held the trigger for 3 seconds, then released. He pulled out of the dive hard. 4Gs, 5Gs. The Corsair handled it easily. Walsh leveled off at 8,000 feet and pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair accelerated. 320 knots, 340. He was pulling away from the bombers and the Zero's escort. Behind him, the damaged bomber was falling out of formation, trailing thick black smoke. Walsh had scored his first kill in a Corsair, but he'd also learned something important. The Corsair could do things the Wildcat never could. The dive speed was phenomenal. The pull-out G-forces didn't stress the airframe. The acceleration after the attack was incredible. And the Zeros hadn't even tried to follow him. They couldn't. By the time the Zero escorts reacted to the attack, Walsh was already 2 miles away and accelerating. The performance gap was enormous. Over the next 3 weeks, F4U flew dozens of combat missions. They escorted bombers, they flew fighter sweeps, they intercepted Japanese raids, and they killed Zeros. The tactics were simple and devastatingly effective. Stay fast, stay high, attack from altitude with speed, make one pass, extend away, never turn with a Zero at low speeds, never slow down. Use the Corsair's strengths, avoid its weaknesses. By early March 1943, F4U had shot down 23 Japanese aircraft. Walsh personally had 5 confirmed kills. He was an ace. But more importantly, he and his squadron were proving the Corsair was a game-changer. Japanese pilots noticed the new American fighter immediately. It looked different from the Wildcat, longer nose. Bent wings, faster, much faster. When Zero pilots tried their standard tactics, diving on the Corsairs from above and forcing them into turning fights, the Corsairs simply extended away. The Zeros couldn't catch them. When Zero pilots tried to climb away after an attack, the Corsairs followed them up. The climb rate was nearly equal. The Corsairs stayed in firing range. When Zero pilots tried to escape by diving away, the Corsairs followed them down and stayed behind them through the entire dive. The speed advantage was overwhelming. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Corsairs reported the same observations. The new American fighter was faster than anything they'd faced. It could dive faster. It could climb nearly as well as a Zero. And it was far more heavily armed, 6 machine guns instead of 4. The firepower was devastating. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu was a veteran Zero pilot with 18 confirmed kills. He'd been flying combat missions since the attack on Pearl Harbor. He knew how to fight Wildcats. He knew their weaknesses and how to exploit them. But in March 1943, Tanimizu encountered Corsairs for the first time over the Russell Islands. His section of 4 Zeros was escorting bombers when 6 Corsairs dove out of the sun. Tanimizu called a brake turn. Standard defensive maneuver. Turn hard into the attack. Force the Americans to turn with you. Exploit the Zero's superior maneuverability. But the Corsairs didn't turn. They made a single firing pass and extended away at high speed. One of the bombers exploded. Another fell out of formation streaming fuel. The Corsairs were already 2 miles away, and climbing back to altitude before Tanimizu could get his Zeros turned around. He tried to pursue. The Zeros couldn't close the distance. The Corsairs climbed away. Tanimizu had never seen an American fighter perform like that. The speed was unnatural. The climb rate was impossible for an aircraft that heavy. He reported the encounter when he landed. His squadron commander listened carefully. Other pilots were reporting similar experiences. The new American fighter was changing the dynamics of air combat. By April 1943, Japanese intelligence had identified the aircraft as the Vought F4U Corsair. They'd examined gun camera footage from Zeros that survived encounters. They'd interviewed pilots. They'd studied the aircraft's performance characteristics as best they could from combat observations. The conclusions were disturbing. The Corsair was faster than the Zero in level flight. Top speed approximately 400 miles per hour versus 330 for the Zero. The Corsair could dive faster than any Japanese fighter. The Corsair's armament was heavier. 6 50 caliber machine guns versus 2 20mm cannons, and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns on the Zero. The Corsair had better high-altitude performance. Above 15,000 feet, the Corsair's engine maintained power better than the Zero's. The only advantages the Zero retained were low-speed maneuverability and range. But those advantages didn't matter if Corsair pilots refused to fight at low speeds. Japanese pilots tried to adapt their tactics. Some tried to bait Corsairs into turning fights by presenting vulnerable targets, damaged bombers, isolated fighters, anything to make the Americans commit to a slow-speed engagement. But American pilots had been trained extensively. They knew the Zero's advantages. They refused to take the bait. Other Japanese pilots tried aggressive head-on attacks. If the Corsairs were diving from altitude, Japanese pilots would climb to meet them head-on. Force a collision course. Make the American break off first. But Corsair pilots accepted head-on engagements. The Corsair's 6 machine guns put out more firepower than a Zero's armament. In a head-on pass, the Corsair usually won. The structural strength made a difference too. The Corsair could absorb hits that would destroy a Zero. Japanese pilots began to realize they were facing an aircraft designed specifically to counter everything the Zero did well. The Americans had studied the Zero's weaknesses. They'd built an aircraft that exploited those weaknesses perfectly. And they'd trained their pilots to use tactics that maximized the Corsair's advantages. By May 1943, more Marine squadrons were receiving Corsairs. VMF-121 arrived at Guadalcanal with F4U-1s. VMF-122 followed. VMF-213 deployed to the Russell Islands. Each squadron brought more Corsairs into combat. Each squadron added to the growing kill count against Japanese aircraft. The Japanese tried everything. They increased escort strength. Instead of 15 Zeros escorting 9 bombers, they used 30 Zeros. But that just meant more targets for the Corsairs. They changed formation tactics. They tried higher altitudes. They tried lower altitudes. They tried different times of day. Nothing worked. The Corsairs adapted to every change. In June 1943, the campaign moved north to the Central Solomons. American forces invaded New Georgia Island. Marine Corsair squadrons provided air cover. Japanese bombers from Rabaul attempted to strike the invasion fleet. The Corsairs intercepted every raid. The kill ratios were staggering. On June 16, 1943, 31 Corsairs from 3 Marine squadrons intercepted a raid of 60 Japanese aircraft over the Russell Islands. The battle lasted 37 minutes. The Corsairs shot down 24 Japanese aircraft. 2 Corsairs were lost, 1 to anti-aircraft fire from friendly ships, 1 to a mid-air collision with a Zero. The kill ratio was 12-1 if you only counted the air-to-air loss. The Japanese lost experienced pilots they couldn't replace. The training pipeline couldn't produce pilots fast enough, and the pilots they were producing had less training time than the veterans who were dying. Average flight training time for Japanese naval aviators had been 700 hours in 1941. By mid-1943, it was down to 300 hours. Some pilots were being sent to combat with less than 200 hours of flight time. They were flying against American pilots who had 400 to 600 hours of training plus months of combat experience. And they were flying Zeros against Corsairs. It was a mismatch at every level. Lieutenant Takeo Tanemizu survived through June 1943. His kill count reached 23. He was one of the best pilots in his squadron. But in July 1943, Tanemizu's luck ran out. His section was escorting bombers to Munda when Corsairs attacked from above. Tanemizu tried the standard defensive break. The Corsairs followed him through the turn. He tried to reverse. The Corsairs reversed with him. He tried to dive away. The Corsairs followed him down and stayed behind him. Tanemizu pushed his Zero to maximum speed, 400 kilometers per hour. The Corsairs were still gaining. One of them opened fire. Tanemizu saw tracers flash past his canopy. He broke hard left. The Corsair followed. More tracers. Hits on his wing. Hits on his fuselage. His engine seized. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Smoke poured from the engine. Tanemizu knew he was done. He pointed his Zero toward the water and prepared for a water landing. He survived the ditching. He was rescued by a Japanese patrol boat 6 hours later, but his Zero was gone. His aircraft was at the bottom of the ocean, and Tanamizu never flew combat again. He'd been shot down by a Corsair, using tactics he couldn't counter with an aircraft that couldn't compete. When Tanamizu reported back to his squadron, he told his commanding officer the truth. The Corsair was superior to the Zero in every category that mattered in modern combat: speed, firepower, durability. American pilots were better trained, American tactics were more effective, and American production was overwhelming. For every Corsair the Japanese shot down, 3 more arrived to replace it. The war was being lost in the air. By August 1943, Japanese pilots had developed a specific fear of Corsairs. They called the aircraft the Whistling Death because of the distinctive sound the air intakes made during high-speed dives. The sound was terrifying, a rising whistle that grew louder as the Corsair approached. By the time you heard it clearly, the Corsair was already in firing position. Some pilots claimed you could identify a Corsair by sound alone. Others said the bent wings were unmistakable, even at long range. Either way, when Japanese pilots spotted Corsairs, they knew they were in serious trouble. In September 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons moved forward to Munda Airfield on New Georgia. They were now within 250 miles of Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the South Pacific. Rabaul had over 90,000 Japanese troops, hundreds of aircraft, and was the headquarters for the entire Japanese Southeast Area fleet. American strategy was to isolate Rabaul through air power, destroy the aircraft, sink the ships, make the base unusable. Corsair squadrons would be critical to that strategy. The offensive began in October 1943. Large formations of American bombers escorted by Corsairs struck Rabaul repeatedly. The Japanese defended with everything they had: Zeros, land-based fighters, anti-aircraft batteries. The air battles over Rabaul became the most intense fighting of the Pacific War. On November 1, 1943, 100 American aircraft struck Rabaul. 75 of the escorts were Corsairs. They encountered over 100 Japanese fighters. The battle lasted 90 minutes. The Corsairs shot down 20 Japanese aircraft. 3 Corsairs were lost. On November 2nd, another strike. Similar numbers, similar results. 26 Japanese aircraft shot down. 4 Corsairs lost. The pattern continued through November. Every few days, another massive strike. Every strike met by fierce Japanese resistance. Every battle ending with Japanese losses far exceeding American losses. Kenneth Walsh was flying missions over Rabaul in November 1943. By then, he had 14 confirmed kills. He was one of the leading Marine aces. On November 15th, Walsh led a division of 4 Corsairs escorting bombers to Rabaul. His division was at 25,000 feet when approximately 40 Zeros attacked from above. Walsh called a defensive break. His division split. 2 Corsairs went left. 2 went right. The Zeros tried to follow both elements. Walsh reversed his turn and found himself behind 3 Zeros climbing away. He selected the trailing Zero and opened fire. His tracers converged on the Zero's fuselage. The Zero's engine erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away. Walsh had no time to watch. Another Zero was turning toward him. Walsh dove away, building speed. The Zero tried to follow. Walsh extended the distance easily. He climbed back to altitude and rejoined his wingman. The fight continued for another 40 minutes. Walsh shot down 2 more Zeros before the bombers completed their attack and the formation headed home. 3 kills in 1 mission. Walsh's total was now 17. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Walsh also noticed something during that mission. The Japanese pilots seemed less aggressive than earlier in the year. They attacked, but they didn't press their attacks. When Walsh or other Corsair pilots reversed on them, the Japanese pilots broke off and tried to escape. It wasn't cowardice. It was survival instinct. The Japanese pilots had learned that engaging Corsairs head-on was suicide. Better to harass them from a distance. Better to survive the mission. The change in Japanese tactics reflected the psychological impact the Corsair was having. Japanese pilots no longer believed they could win against Corsairs in equal numbers. They needed numerical superiority. 2-to-1 odds. 3-to-1. Even then, they were cautious. The Corsair had broken the myth of Japanese air superiority. The Zero was no longer the dominant fighter in the Pacific. By December 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons had been in combat for 10 months. The statistics were clear. Corsairs had shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft. Corsair losses in air-to-air combat were fewer than 30. The kill ratio was better than 13-to-1. It was the most one-sided aerial combat record of any fighter in the Pacific War at that point. Better than the Wildcat. Better than the Army's P-38 Lightning. Better than anything. But the most remarkable period was yet to come. In January 1944, Allied forces invaded the Marshall Islands. Marine Corsair squadrons moved forward to newly captured airfields. They were now within range of the major Japanese base at Truk in the Caroline Islands. Truk was Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. A massive naval anchorage protected by reefs and defended by hundreds of aircraft. American strategy was to neutralize Truk through sustained air attack. Between January 17th and March 20th, 1944, a period of 64 days, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons flew continuous offensive operations against Japanese targets. They escorted bombers. They flew fighter sweeps. They intercepted Japanese counterattacks. They struck airfields, shipping, and ground installations. The combat was relentless, multiple missions per day. Pilots flew until they were exhausted, then flew again. Maintenance crews worked around the clock keeping aircraft operational. The tempo was unsustainable, but it worked. During those 64 days, Corsair pilots shot down over 2,140 Japanese aircraft. The number is almost incomprehensible. 2,140 confirmed kills in 64 days. That's an average of 33 Japanese aircraft shot down every single day for more than 2 months. Some days were higher. Some days were lower, but the average was 33 per day. The vast majority of those kills were scored by Corsair pilots. Some P-38 Lightning pilots contributed. Some Hellcat pilots contributed. But Corsairs dominated the fighting. They were faster, more maneuverable at high speeds, better armed. The pilots were experienced. The tactics were proven. And the Japanese simply couldn't stop them. Japanese commanders at Truk watched their air strength evaporate. They received replacement aircraft regularly, new Zeros, new bombers. But the replacements were destroyed as fast as they arrived, sometimes faster. Corsairs would strike an airfield at dawn, destroying aircraft on the ground. Replacement aircraft would arrive at noon. Corsairs would strike again at 2 p.m., destroying the replacements before they could even be refueled. The Japanese couldn't maintain any operational strength. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, American carrier task forces struck Truk in Operation Hailstone. The 2-day raid involved over 1,200 aircraft sorties. Corsairs from Marine squadrons flying from land bases provided additional support. Together, they destroyed 275 Japanese aircraft in the air and on the ground. They sank 12 Japanese ships, including 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 6 cargo vessels. Truk was effectively neutralized. It would never again serve as a major operational base. The Japanese tried to reinforce. They flew in experienced pilots from other theaters. They increased anti-aircraft defenses. They changed their tactics. They tried night operations when Corsairs were less effective. But nothing worked. The fundamental problem was the Corsair was simply a better aircraft, flown by better trained pilots, using better tactics, supported by overwhelming logistics. The Japanese couldn't match any of those advantages. By late March 1944, Japanese air strength in the Central Pacific was broken. They'd lost thousands of aircraft. More importantly, they'd lost thousands of pilots. Experienced pilots. Pilots with hundreds of hours of combat time, pilots who understood how to fight. Those pilots were irreplaceable. The training system couldn't produce pilots of that quality. The new pilots arriving at combat units had minimal training. They were flying inferior aircraft against superior opposition. They died quickly. Some lasted a week. Some lasted days. A few lasted hours. Their deaths barely registered in the statistics because the kill counts were so high. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top surviving aces. He'd been flying combat missions since China in 1938. He had 64 confirmed kills. He'd survived wounds that should have killed him. He'd flown against every American fighter. Wildcats, Lightnings, Hellcats, Corsairs. In April 1944, Sakai wrote in his journal that the Corsair was the most dangerous American fighter he'd encountered. He wrote that the Corsair combined speed, firepower, and durability in ways that made it nearly impossible to defeat in combat. He wrote that Japanese pilots feared the Corsair more than any other American aircraft, not because it was invincible, but because it had no significant weaknesses a zero pilot could exploit. The Wildcat was slow, the Lightning was less maneuverable, the Hellcat was good but not exceptional at anything, the Corsair was exceptional at everything that mattered: speed, climb, dive, firepower. It could fight on its own terms and dictate the engagement. Japanese pilots couldn't force Corsairs into the kind of fight the Zero could win. Sakai's assessment was shared throughout the Japanese Naval Air Force. Pilots who survived encounters with Corsairs reported the same observations. The aircraft was too fast, too well armed, too tough. And the pilots flying Corsairs were too well trained. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't take unnecessary risks. They fought methodically, professionally, lethally. By mid-1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively. American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific. The Marshall Islands were secure. The Marianas were the next target, and Marine Corsair squadrons were leading the air offensive. Kenneth Walsh continued flying combat missions through 1944. His kill count reached 21. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions over the Russell Islands in August 1943. He survived the war and stayed in the Marine Corps, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1962. He flew Corsairs longer than any other aircraft in his career. He told anyone who would listen that the Corsair saved his life repeatedly. Its speed got him out of situations that would have killed him in a Wildcat. Its firepower allowed him to destroy targets with short bursts. Its durability brought him home after taking battle damage that would have downed lesser aircraft. Walsh wasn't alone in his assessment. Other Corsair pilots echoed his sentiments. Major Gregory Boyington, commander of VM F214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, flew Corsairs exclusively during his combat tour. Boyington shot down 28 Japanese aircraft, all while flying Corsairs. He was eventually shot down and captured in January 1944, but he survived the war. When asked about the Corsair after his release, Boyington said it was the finest fighter aircraft he'd ever flown. He said the Corsair gave him confidence. When he climbed into the cockpit, he knew he was flying the best aircraft in the Pacific. That psychological advantage was as important as the technical advantages. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the Corsair. They tried. Engineers at Mitsubishi worked on improved versions of the Zero. The A6M5 model had better high-speed performance, stronger wing structure, better dive characteristics. But it still couldn't match the Corsair's speed or firepower. The Japanese also developed new fighters. The Kawanishi N-1KJ Shiden, called George by the Allies, was fast and well-armed. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, called Jack, had excellent climb rate, but production numbers were low. Quality control was poor. And even these improved fighters arrived too late to change the outcome. By 1945, American Corsair squadrons dominated the skies over Japan itself. They flew from carriers that had been modified to accommodate the Corsair's landing characteristics. The Navy had finally solved the visibility and bounce problems through improved landing techniques and minor design modifications. Corsairs struck targets throughout the Japanese home islands. They escorted bombers to Tokyo. They strafed airfields. They attacked shipping. Japanese pilots defending their homeland faced the same aircraft that had destroyed their comrades throughout the Pacific. The psychological impact was devastating. Some Japanese pilots refused to engage Corsairs. They would orbit at a distance, waiting for the Corsairs to leave. Others attacked recklessly, knowing they would probably die but hoping to take at least one Corsair with them. Most died without achieving anything. The Corsair's combat record speaks for itself. By the end of World War II, Corsair pilots had shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft during that remarkable 64-day period alone. Over the entire war, Corsairs accounted for over 64% of all aircraft destroyed by American fighters in the Pacific. That percentage is staggering. It means nearly 2 out of every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down by American fighters fell to Corsair guns. The F6F Hellcat had comparable total kills, but the Corsair's kill-to-loss ratio was superior, 11-1 overall. Some squadrons achieved ratios exceeding 20-1. The Corsair remained in production longer than any other piston-engine fighter in American history. Production continued until 1952. Over 12,500 Corsairs were built. They served in Korea, where Corsair pilots flew ground attack missions and close air support. They served with foreign air forces through the 1960s. The French Navy used Corsairs in Indochina and Algeria. The Honduran Air Force operated Corsairs until 1969, making them the last military force to fly the type operationally. Rex Beisel, the engineer who designed the inverted gull-wing, retired from Vought in 1958. He received numerous engineering awards for the Corsair design, though he remained modest about his achievement. He said the Corsair succeeded because the Navy gave him the freedom to prioritize performance over conventional design practices. He died in 1977 at age 82. His obituary mentioned the Corsair prominently. It was his masterpiece. Several Corsairs remain airworthy today. They appear at air shows throughout the United States, their distinctive bent wings and powerful engines reminding audiences of the aircraft that changed the Pacific War. The sound is unmistakable, that deep roar from the R2800 engine. The whistle from the air intakes during high speed passes. Japanese pilots who heard that sound in combat never forgot it. Some described it decades later, the fear still evident in their voices. That sound meant death was approaching fast, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The historical record is clear. The Corsair was the fighter Japanese pilots feared most during World War II, not because it was invincible, but because it eliminated every advantage the Zero possessed. It was faster where speed mattered, more powerful where power mattered, better armed where firepower mattered, and it was flown by pilots trained specifically to exploit those advantages. The Japanese had no answer for it. They tried adapting tactics, they tried improved aircraft, they tried numerical superiority. Nothing worked. The Corsair and the men who flew it dominated the Pacific skies from 1943 until the end of the war. That 64-day period when Corsair pilots shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in military aviation history. 33 enemy aircraft destroyed per day for more than 2 months. It wasn't just tactical superiority, it was complete aerial dominance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. That's how air superiority actually happens in war. Not through individual heroism alone, though courage matters. Not through superior numbers alone, though numbers help. But through the combination of superior technology, superior training, superior tactics, and superior logistics all working together to create an overwhelming advantage the enemy cannot counter. The Corsair represented all of those elements. It was the right aircraft, flown by the right pilots, at the right time. And it changed the war.